Few Ventrue that unlived through it look back on the Enlightenment or the revolutions that resulted from it with any fondness. The American Revolution, 1776, the French Revolution, 1789, the Haitian Revolution, 1791, the Spanish-American Revolutions, 1808, the July Revolution, 1830, and don't even mention the year 1848 around some elders. Vampires, regardless of sect or clan, are dependent to some degree on human society. And for the Ventrue, a clan that prizes wealth, power, and status above all else, socio-political stability is necessary to ensure that those things flourish. And the thing about revolutions is that they are inherently destabilizing, regardless of whether you agree with their politics or not. A successful revolution inevitably means the overthrow of an old system by a new one. It's no longer just the king is dead, long live the king. You're literally replacing an entire system of government with a new one. And that's generally bad news if you're the kind of person who profits from the status quo. Back when the Age of Discovery began at the tail end of the 15th century, it had been the Sabbat that had been first across the Atlantic to infest the new human colonies of the Americas. Despite their best efforts to keep their rivals out, the Camarilla, including the Ventrue, made some inroads, particularly into the 13 colonies set up by the British. And then the American Revolution happened, and a lot of that work was undone. The Ventrue suffered especially as it had been younger members of the clan seeking new opportunities that had crossed to the New World, and these were in turn picked off by their Sabbat enemies. Luckily for the Ventrue and the Camarilla as a whole, the Sabbat had its first civil war a few decades later, giving the rival sect the opening it needed to regain the lost ground. And so, while the United States remains highly contested ground between the two sects well into the modern nights, the Camarilla, with the Ventrue at the forefront, was able to establish a secure foothold in the Americas. After 1848, things seemed to calm down in the Western world, and the vampires all went back to doing what they'd always done: observing humanity from the shadows, feeding off of them in terms of both blood and treasure, and manipulating human politics as it suited the interests of the undead. One great example would be the American Civil War. Seeing as they view all humanity as chattel to be fed upon at will, the Ventrue really didn't care one way or another for the issue of slavery or states' rights. But since there were a lot of Sabbat strongholds in what was then the Confederate States of America, packs and coteries of Ventrue vampires were more than happy to follow the Union Army in its incursions into the South, most famously during William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia. As the Army of Tennessee and the Army of Georgia slashed and burnt their way through the South, the Ventrue shadowed them, destroying many Sabbat vampires caught up in the chaos, capturing Atlanta and Savannah, allowing the Camarilla to extend its influence further into the South. However, the Ventrue saw their greatest success in the latter half of the 19th century in Europe. After 1848, it seemed that the fire of revolution had finally been snuffed out. Any rebellions that sprang up afterwards were swiftly put down by the authorities. With all that done, and with no influence left in the New World apart from a few islands in the Caribbean and Canada, the great powers of Europe, strengthened by the technology of the Industrial Revolution, turned their eyes to the rest of the Old World. Thus, a new era of imperialism and colonialism began, and with it, the Victorian Age, which many Ventrue argue was a second golden age for the clan, equaling that of the glory days of Rome. Naturally, the Ventrue had their undead fingers in every imperial pie, whether it was big boys like Russia or France, small but relatively spunky powers like Belgium and the Netherlands, and even those empires who had had a good start but whose glory days had waned, like Portugal, Denmark, and Spain. The Ventrue were also heavily involved in the unification of Germany and its subsequent imperialism, although in true Camarilla fashion, they mostly did this by letting Otto von Bismarck do all the work and only intervening when some backward-thinking kindred or Sabbat assassin tried to kill the minister-president. But of course, if we're talking the Victorian Age, we must address the big mama of them all, the British Empire. For all vampires, the Victorian world was divided into two parts. the lands of barbarism, where the Sabbat reigned supreme and still gloried in terrorizing superstitious mortals, and the lands of civilization, where the Camarilla reigned supreme. And with the British Empire at its height, the city of London, its capital, became the beating heart of the Camarilla. In fact, in those days, the Camarilla were so wedded to the British Empire that the sect itself was referred to as simply the Empire. And Clan Ventrue was at the heart of it all, managing internal affairs and otherwise stewarding that which Hardestat the Younger had helped to create. New technology and new ideas allowed for new opportunities for even young members of the clan, although of course many elders lamented the waning of the old feudal values, sneering at the increasingly loud voice of the mob as the old aristocracy waned and new industrial and business elites took their place. But for most members of the clan, the transition was not too difficult. The Ventrue had always believed that those who lead should be held to high standards of ability and of personal conduct. Of course, the Ventrue naturally think that they are innately better at meeting these higher standards than the other clans, but we already know about that. And so, the virtue of noblesse oblige, cultivated during the Dark Ages, transitioned rather smoothly into the behavioral proprieties of being a good Victorian gentleman or gentlewoman. Depending on what sourcebook you're using, either Mithras still reigned supreme in London around this time, or power has passed to his former seneschal, Anne Bosley, who would later style herself Queen Anne. But even if London remained the nerve center for both mortal and vampiric activities at the time, the fact that Britain controlled a quarter of the world meant that there were plenty of opportunities for younger kindred in the colonies, the wealthiest of these being India. And it is here that we must talk about the one and only bloodline to be produced by Clan Ventrue apart from the anti-tribu, the Danava, a bloodline descending from Vedarta, one of the childers, supposedly, of the Ventrue antediluvian, although some sources, particularly in the early editions, suggest that Vedarta was himself the Ventrue antediluvian. Certainly, the Danava believe this, claiming descent from him and thinking themselves the true Ventrue, and that the main clan are a bunch of imposters. Vampires descended from the Ventrue antediluvian have been in India since the dawn of human history. One noteworthy example being the great Bindusara, who was a contemporary of the mortal ruler Chandragupta Maurya, founder of India's first great empire, and in fact even still exists in the modern Knights, residing in Alexandria. Just as the Ventrue of Christendom and the Islamic world were influenced by local customs and beliefs, the Danava fully embraced Hinduism, arranging themselves along with the other vampires into a mirror image of the Hindu caste system. Naturally, the Danava identify with the very top of Hindu society, the Brahmin priest caste, and in fact will only embrace humans from that caste. For many centuries, the Danava were mostly defined by a conflict within their own ranks over the exact origin of their bloodline. One school of thought argued that their sire, Vedarta, was descended from the goddess Danu, an ancient primordial figure in Hinduism. Another school of thought insists that the Danava are Asuras, demons made flesh, while still others insist that they were Devas, manifestations of the will of the Hindu gods upon the earth. This dispute over origins became so fierce that during the 13th century, those who adhered to the Ashura origin made it a habit of hunting down and assassinating those who adhered to the Deva origin story. When not arguing with and even murdering each other over what their origin was, the Danava lived and behaved much like the undead counterparts of Brahmin priests. They observed rites, made sacrifice to the Hindu gods, studied the ancient texts, engaged in divination, and practiced a unique form of blood magic known as sadhana, which they believe will help them one day transcend their undead existence, essentially a vampiric equivalent of achieving nirvana and escaping the cycle of reincarnation. The Danava, along with most of the Hindu vampires of India, lost a great deal of their power in the subcontinent in the year 1001, when the first Muslim invasions of India began, bringing with them many Ashira, or Muslim vampires. Then a few centuries later came the first Mongol invasions of India, and with them another breed of undead from the Far East, the Kuei Jin. Eventually, the three factions of undead in the subcontinent settled into an uneasy coexistence, although the Ashira maintained a dominant position. That all changed in 1829 when Clan Tremere arrived and established its first chantry in India. Sensing an opportunity, the Hindu vampires, including the Danava, as well as many younger Ashira, joined with the newcomers from Europe to destroy the power base of the Ashira elders, launching their campaign during the backdrop of the Great Indian Mutiny of 1857. The end result was an uneasy four-way stalemate, with the natives, Camarilla, Ashira, and Kuei Jin jockeying for influence in the subcontinent. The thing is, the Ventrue are not particularly fond of this bloodline of the Danava, mostly because they don't like the idea of bloodlines in general. They view them as corruptions of the pure lineage of the antediluvians. So for a long time they tried to ignore the connection between themselves and the Danava. But when the Danava began proclaiming that they were the true heirs of the Ventrue antediluvian and that the Ventrue themselves were the imposters, it kind of erased any doubt that they were in fact a Ventrue bloodline, because who else would be that arrogant? This minor embarrassment aside, the Ventrue for the most part enjoyed the Victorian age, and while they knew all mortal things must come to an end, they were not expecting this second golden age to end so soon or so abruptly. But then the world wars happened and everything changed.